apparently Destiny wants to talk.
Destiny is messaging me. Oh, God. All right. What are we up to? Drag me in. I'm not even streaming. Do you mind me bringing him in?
He
might target you instead of me.
No, yeah, he absolutely will. He did some very vicious personal attacks.
Can I moderate? Can I be that?
You could try to mod, but ultimately, if it gets to, because I have stuff to do tonight. I have a stream tomorrow with the professor on Canadian blood-scale crisis.
Yeah, sure. Hold on. Let me boom.
I will legitimately leave, and people will say, "Oh, you're being a coward," but I'm not interested in having a spat.
I know. He's got the Destiny debate tactics. I know. I'm joking. I understand. Okay, hold on. Wait, how the fuck do I do this? Add friends. Oh, I see. Okay, here we go. Add friends to DM. On me, Destiny. Here we go. Group DM. Hello.
Oh, hello. Hey, how's it going?
Hey there.
Hello.
Oh, so before Mr. Remdiker over here mischaracterized my position as go and murder all the natives in steal their land. Basically,
I never said that. What are you talking about? Wait, I never said that. That's what your position.
Wait, would it be possible for me to moderate this? I feel so calm right now.
Actually, we can just find the tweet that he launched like 30 seconds after.
When did I say that you should go? That you were advocating to murder all the people? I never said that you were going to murder or hurt any Indigenous people. Only that you were going to wipe out their culture as a result of displacing them from their land. That is all I've attributed to you.
Only aspect of their culture, their land.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, quite literally the primary focus of Indigenous worldviews, and specifically, I believe, of the Wet'suwet'en people.
Pretending that Indigenous peoples of Canada might be listening to this right now. So you, as somebody that is relatively clueless about most of their culture, which I know you are, you would feel comfortable saying, "Oh yeah," as a white guy who has no idea what most people think. I think that their culture is like 99% their land, dude. That's the argument you want to go with.
I can speak specifically to the cultures that I'm familiar with.
Which ones are those, Rem?
The Gwich'in people, the Mi'kmaq people, Six Nations.
So Gwich'in people have so if I were to go and research, like Gwich'in, first of all, the Six Nations, didn't they change from 5 nations to 6 nations? Like, haven't they even changed lands over the history of their existence?
They incorporate. It was a confederation. So, but
okay. So if I go look at like the history of the Gwich'in people or any of these Indigenous peoples, you're telling me they've never switched lands before ever?
No, not the Gwich'in people. No.
Okay.
I don't understand.
Wait. Would it be possible, just so we're actually discussing the ideas really quickly, Rem, would it be possible to acknowledge that while land does change hands, land is still a fairly substantial part of their culture, and for that reason, the context in which these lands change can often be an important component in the extent to which it destroys or damages their culture?
Well, yeah. So I want to make clear that I'm not saying that like a culture is not something that needs to necessarily strike back to the beginning of time. So obviously these people migrated from northwestern Canada and the United States all the way to the south. So, and these migratory patterns happened up, after contact, but then they formed their new culture around the lands that they now inhabited. And like I said, I'm not going to attribute this view to every single, nation or tribe out there. Obviously that's absurd. But from all of the ones that I'm familiar with, the Gwich'in people, the Iroquois, the Mi'kmaq, Ojibwe, right? All of these that I'm familiar with in Canada and some parts in, the Rust Belt area, these are all people who have their culture inherently tied to the land. And if you remove them from their land, you are removing an essential part of their culture. That is a view I will absolutely stand by, based on what I have learned about the subject. If you have a source that says that land isn't an integral part of these people's culture, I will absolutely read it, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. Okay.
Sorry, I'm just reading real quick. Unfortunately, when I get into these types of arguments, I've learned that I can never take anything for granted because most of the time people are very comfortable lying.
Do you want me to bring up? I can bring up for you. I have a whole book.
Me too, brother.
I'm sure you have the book. I know you haven't read it though, so I don't care. I know you haven't read it.
You don't think I've read it?
No, I know you haven't. Rem, when we got into a conversation 2 days ago, I have no idea about any of the Indigenous peoples whatsoever, and you very comfortably made the claim
that the majority.
Oh, what can I? Chill.
It's totally unnecessary.
I'm not making a character attack. I'm talking about the knowledge that you failed to have. A couple days ago when we spoke, you very confidently asserted that yesterday, you very confidently asserted that the majority of Indigenous people lived very far north in Canada where no one else did. And you linked me a map that proved the own map you linked me was made that incorrect. You spoke in vague generalities about literally everything. It's pretty clear that you have like a surface level, like barely Wikipedia knowledge of this. You have not read any books on this. It's painfully obvious. Do you want to tell me right now that whatever book you were about to cite, you've actually read it cover to cover on this topic?
Sure. I can give you 5. I can give you 10.
Wait, you gave me.
Want to go grab them? They're literally right here. We're going to measure our dicks.
You can tell me that you've read 10 books cover to cover on this.
Yes.
But you couldn't speak in any more than a lot of people like this, or a lot of people like that, or some of them.
What is the underlying contention here?
But I know that you don't know.
My problem is that Rem didn't really have a good grasp of what he was talking about. He's pretending like he's an authority on the subject. It's insane to me.
Wait,
I don't know why he's doing this.
If it could be proven to you that Rem was more knowledgeable than you seem to perceive he is, would you take issue with the takes that he's given?
Well, I don't like to. It's really cringy for me to ask him to like drill down on these things. But like, can you talk to me a little bit about the history of the Iroquois people? I guess
the Iroquois are not like a specific type of people. They're more of a generalized region of Canada that confederated. I could honestly, on the Iroquois, not my best area. My best area would be the northwestern Gwich'in peoples, and probably Micmac and some southwestern.
Weren't the Iroquois, wasn't that league like one of the most like prominent Indigenous peoples leagues that like existed that people talk about? And you say you've read 10 books cover to cover on this type of stuff and you don't know anything about them? Like, I'm sorry, Rem, but you're like, I know you're lying to me. I know you're lying to me. Like, I'm cringing right now for you. I don't know why you can't just admit that, like, okay, sure, I've read a lot of articles on this. I've read some.
Well, I've learned about the Iroquois because we learned that literally in grade 10, and we learned about the formation of the Iroquois League.
Remember, are you Canadian?
The wars and the pardon?
Are you Canadian?
Yeah, I'm Canadian.
Fuck, that sucks. Sorry.
Why does that suck?
Nothing.
Wait, I'm sorry. What was the first part of that you said? Wait, what did you being Canadian have to do with that?
Well, because we learn it in our curriculums.
Okay. Wait. So then, why don't you know anything about them?
I do know about the Iroquois, but for modern day Iroquois nations and their current cultures is not something I'm very well read up on.
But you very confidently
to colonialist powers I do know about, but that's not going to be relevant for our conversation.
It's very relevant because just a few minutes ago, you very confidently asserted that none of these people have ever moved from their lands before because their land is an integral part of their identity.
When did I say that they haven't moved away from I literally just told you that, of course, they migrated from the northwestern areas of Canada. I literally said
then
that.
It sounds like these people are able to move. Oh, cool. Then we have no... Yeah, then we have no disagreement.
Wait.
Cool.
Even if we acknowledge that they are able to move, I don't think that necessarily follows that it does no harm to them to expect them to move at the state's request.
Yeah, of course. So my original argument to anybody that was listening and wasn't just trying to look for slam dunks was that if there exists some territory within the borders of your country that has resources that can dramatically enrich the lives of your people, I probably wouldn't let a group of squatters that are sitting on it overrule the rest of the country and even the rest of the other indigenous tribes and say, we don't want anything touching this land. That seems insane to me.
Well, how would you feel if they were just private citizens, though? If it had nothing to do with native rights, if there was just like a neighborhood and it was owned by some company or by a group of individual proprietors, would you have the state bowl over them in the same way?
Yeah, you eminent domain those people. It sucks, but like sometimes for the benefit of society, like you can't allow like a couple people to just ruin it for everybody else because they were at some spot before somebody else was. It's a really silly way, in my opinion, of going about doling out land.
Well, I do acknowledge that. I think your use of the word squatters does kind of belie an impression of these people that might not be.
I didn't want to comment on it, but
Rem, you love commenting on it because you feel like you're getting slam dunks all the time. So the reality is that Rem is saying that they should have it because they were there first. That's a squatter. You got there first, so you keep it.
But that's our argument.
Regardless of the benefits of the other people around them, regardless of the harm caused to the other people around, and regardless of what the majority will of the other indigenous tribes there are. You think that because they got there first, they have not only have rights to land, but they have the right to the land, irregardless of what the rest of Canada or indigenous peoples want, and no one has a right to even touch anything on it.
The argument for the existence of states, though. I mean, if you disagree with that principle, you have to necessarily disagree with any kind of stated boundary. because
Not
that's
at all. States exist within a federal system that have to make compromises with each other all the time. In the American system, I imagine, probably in the provincial system of Canadian Parliament as well.
But if we do the Mexican people an infinite amount of good for them to annex some portion of American land, there is no force on earth that could move us in that regard. We were here first.
Wait, can you say that again?
Yeah, so like if the people of Mexico, the government, the people, whatever, thought that they could substantially benefit the people of their land by annexing a portion of the United States of America, the argument we would use fundamentally is, no, fuck off, this is our land. And while I don't disagree that, I mean, hey, listen, I'm an anarchist, fuck property rights, but if that's the argument you want to make, we also have to recognize this could be applied in a lot of other contexts that I don't know if you would necessarily agree with.
Well, but it can't, because Mexico can't annex land from the United States.
Right. Legally is wait, are we talking legally or morally here?
I'm like, well, practically, they wouldn't be able to, right? The United States maintains its own borders, and the United States has the capability of maintaining and defending its own borders.
So
right?
wait, but that's the might makes right argument. So then you're saying if the Wet'suwet'en people, wait, can I clarify if I may? So your argument there was that we have the strength to sovereignly defend our borders. Yeah, but the Wet'suwet'en don't, of course. But then if we're saying the only reason we get to take their land but Mexico couldn't take ours is because we're strong and they're not, we're implicitly saying that the worth of taking land is a product of the extent to which they're capable of defending it, which is
so to some extent, right. I think that there's a nugget of truth in there. So the idea would be is that if they exist literally at the only as a result of another country being there to provide as much for them as they can, right, which they do. So for instance, any of these indigenous peoples that exist in these countries are literally only there because other countries are surrounding them, keeping them safe, probably providing them with a lot of tax subsidies and whatnot to keep them going. Not to say that that's enough, because we've screwed over a lot of these people in a ton of different ways. I think it's okay if the entire rest of the country that is involved in supporting these like small indigenous tribes is like, hey, listen, we kind of want to run a pipeline through your land. Like, I know it kind of sucks. You can keep everything else. We're not going to come and kill you. We're not going to steal anything or whatever, but like, we need to partition off some part for this. Like, I'm sure there's a way to figure that out, rather than for these people to have the supreme god rights over land that they can't even like hold themselves, that they rely on subsidies from the government around them to take care of. That's what I think. I think there's a way to work.
Do you think
out.
The fact that they rely on subsidies is component to this? Like, if they didn't, would you grant them more like moral autonomy?
Yeah, I think that if they were a complete and total separate nation, like totally on their own, I think it would be a little different. Sure.
Then the argument that I would sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Destiny. I just wanted to make sure. Then the argument I would make is the only reason they're dependent on the nation is because they've already been the victims of colonization, right? It's not like before the Canadian folk came over there, the French, whatever. It's not like they were like looking out for handouts from Europe. Like, they were autonomous until we put them in a position politically, socially, and economically where they would need to depend on handouts that were given to them by their colonizers. That's
kind of true, and unfortunately, there's no good answer for this, and this is going to trigger the fuck out of a lot of people. But like, you can't really run that argument back more than like, I don't know, a few decades, maybe 100 or 200 or 300 years.
It was a few decades ago that these people were placed in residential schools and were actively oppressed, and there's still sterilization going on in First Nations communities.
That's cool. I'm not okay with oppressive schools, so I don't know why you brought it up, but good point, Rem. But the problem is that like, if you run this back infinitely, Vaush,
that the Canadian government made over the past few decades, that is readily.
Cool. That's cool. That's a cool story. Okay. So the problem is that if you run this back infinitely, these people probably stole the land from somebody else, and then
I don't know why you're acting like such an asshole.
From somebody else. Because you're bringing up because you're bringing up points that I obviously don't disagree with.
Vaush and I were having.
Yeah, because you're bringing up this dumb point. Your tweet was saying that the Canadian government should invade all native communities, remove them from the land, and thereby assimilate them in Canadian culture.
Invade these nations.
No, what I said was that I would try to roll these quote-unquote sovereign Indian nations that aren't even truly sovereign into my country somehow. I'd either make them another province, make them another state, bring them another thing.
And because you were taking over these portions of their lands, you were displacing them from their native lands, and in a sense eradicating their culture because it just inherently.
You're not eradicating. Just because you roll somebody into their country doesn't mean you eradicate their culture.
It does when you displace them for the means.
You don't have to displace them.
What do you mean? If you are shoving a pipeline through their native land, their heritage, that is displacing them from their land. I don't understand.
What does all of the land at the pipeline, is it like miles and miles across, become all uninhabitable? It's all destroyed? Like, what do you mean?
Well, actually, yeah, there's a huge issue that these pipelines do have an awful ecological effect. And I can send you an article that has shown the actual effects on that on First Nations community. So actually, yes, to an extent.
My concern
it drives them away from those areas of the land that have been seen as their ancestral home and of which they have tied their identity.
Saying ancestral, but earlier you acknowledged that these people people have moved around before, so it's not like it's impossible that they could resettle 10 miles away. Like,
my concern. Well, wait, please. You right? You did just say they don't need to resettle, but now you're saying like they could just resettle a bit over. Do you mean like within their own territories?
Sure. Well, he's making it sound like you'd be taking these people and shipping them off to Liberia, like what Lincoln wanted to do.
Okay, but the issue I have here, and I hope you understand that I'm probably not as far over and woke on this as Rem is, because I literally just got in trouble for the black nationalism thing. I don't really care about culture.
Black nationalist, by the way.
I don't care. Well, hold on. Okay, I don't necessarily care about in culture intrinsically, but in the context
I think we can all sort of agree on that, by the way. Just as a little.
Hey, listen, hold up. I've got a lot of people. I've got the fucking Pharaoh mask on my Terraria character and everything. I'm trying to get in good with them.
Literally a fascist on Twitter.
My main concern here is that I feel like this is taking context, or this is taking place in the context of a broader pattern where we're like, okay, we're done invading you. Have your land. But wait, actually, hold on. One more thing. But wait, actually, one more thing. And then we do this, like, we roll it back forever and forever. The issue is that because the Wet'suwet'en people, or people of any other indigenous predilection in our countries, don't really have the social or military autonomy to defend themselves and to defend their provinces, their autonomy only exists until it's inconvenient to us. So even if it might bring about, like, a great good to lay pipe through their lands, I feel like in the context of us continuing to subvert the autonomy we promised them a century and a half ago, it leads to a greater utilitarian harm. I feel like we almost have to respect their rights, if for no other reason than because at this point, to go back on the expectations that have been set for them is tantamount to continuing a genocide that has been going on for a long time.
So I wouldn't say continuing a genocide, but I 100% agree. That's why I said I don't think you can have your cake and eat it too. To grant sovereignty to any indigenous people is a joke. One, it's not real sovereignty because it's going to be disrespected as soon as it's insanely inconvenient to another party, and then two, you're going to continue to run into problems over and over again as the country, the dominating country, tries to exert its influence over the people. That's why it feels to me like the most effective way to do things is to say, hey, you know what? We're going to make you guys a province or a state or a municipality or whatever they have in Canada that would do it, and then now you guys are going to be part of the voting base, the tax base. You're going to blah blah blah, and that seems to be the most effective way to do things, because the reality is that
means removing their governmental structure.
Cool. Okay. So the reality is that
inherently tied to their culture as well.
Well, damn, sounds like their culture needs to come into the 21st century then. Sorry. The reality is that, like, let's say that OPEC, or let's say that a whole bunch of, like, oil-producing countries...
Could I challenge you a little bit?
It's all racism to you, I know, Rem.
Could I challenge you a little bit on that, Destiny?
Wait, real quick. Yeah, sure. Wait,
okay.
I'm just saying, like, my problem is that, like, yeah, and I'm sure everyone here would agree, even Rem would. Yeah, I know, dude. It's white people, right? So the problem is that, like, if we run into some national or international, like, oil shortage or some crazy stuff starts happening and, like, the entire economy of Canada is suffering, there is no possible way that the rest of the Canadian citizens are going to be content to just sit on all the natural resources sitting in certain areas, or not have, like, certain pipelines flowing through just because some people there want it not there, right? These are people that don't have the best interest. Well, why does it matter what the majority of Canadians at one point were totally fine to literally commit genocide against the Indigenous people? We're talking about what the Canadian government should actively be doing right now, not about what the majority. Sure. And I think what the Canadian government should be actively doing is looking out for the majority of its citizens. That's what I think the Canadian government. At all times. Not at all times. I mean, generally there are exceptions to this. So if the majority of Canadians want to actually commit genocide against those people. Oh my God! Hold on. I never even considered that. I'd like it if we could. No, Rem is right. Actually, I would be opposed if the majority of people wanted to commit genocide. Do you want to ask me any others, Rem? Would I be okay if the majority of the people wanted to rape all black people or wanted to murder all children? You said that the Canadian government ought to do what the majority of the people. No, Rem. I actually did. You just made me reconsider my whole point. That was ingenious. When you're done being an asset, then yeah.
Can I clarify? Do you want them to rape all of the Wet'suwet'en people, Destiny?
I never even considered that one before, Vaush. If I'm being totally honest with you, I never considered that the majority could exert a negative influence over a minority of people. I guess since Rem brought that up, I guess the reality is that a minority of people should actually have infinite power over the majority of people. I think that's the reasonable alternative. I think that's a better alternative.
Well, the issue is really to an extent we already kind of believe in that, right? Like here, we do in some classes because we don't believe in tyranny of the majority. For example, the idea of protected classes, right? Fundamentally, what we're doing, like, even if there's a reciprocal benefit here, is we're saying everyone, hundreds of millions of people, can't engage in certain types of discriminatory behavior because it is conceivably capable of hurting a small minority of people. I don't think there's necessarily wrong with that in principle.
Yeah, but we don't do that at the detriment of like the larger group of people generally? Or at least I can't think of like.
Fuck, I'm pretty sure if I thought for it, I could think of times where legally and socially we've adopted policies that respected the autonomy of individuals to the detriment of the majority. But I
guess you could argue that like if you're like a landlord and you really hate trans people,
corporations as people, Vaush.
maybe that like you don't even know what that means, Rem. But like I imagine that if you were like a building owner and you really, what do you think it means when you recognize a corporation as a person, Rem?
It was a fucking meme, like the same way that you were fucking memeing about committing genocide against indigenous people.
Wait.
Why is it that you can make jokes?
What did the meme mean? Can you explain what the meme meant? I just didn't know what you meant by recognizing corporations as people. Do you think it's a silly concept? Why is it silly, Rem?
The joke is that we can recognize a certain type of status to a few people that are not attributed to all people in a given population, and that can be a detriment to the entire population.
Oh, I know one. Wait, I know one, Destiny, that I know for a fact you agree with. Making it so that school districts aren't funded by property taxes. What that's going to do fundamentally is, the wealthier people in a given neighborhood aren't going to have guarantees that their schools will be disproportionately funded. But so that's definitely material harm being done to them. But the poor people in that neighborhood like get a better shot. I think you can make a reasonable argument. There are plenty of decent like examples in our society where we're willing to concede like the well-being of the majority if we can take a principled stance against harming a minority group.
That's kind of true. Okay, I'm about to take a massive lefty position, super woke thing on you.
Hey, I've been waiting for it.
You know how when some people say like racist doesn't mean just being racist, it means powerful prejudice. When I think of majority and minority groups, I usually think of status in society. So for instance, females are a minority in society, even though they're a majority population because they have a minority of power. So like you can discriminate against wealthy people in the forms of like taxation or mixing up school districts. But I mean like there's a very small amount of people that are hurt there. They're not minority power holders, but it like benefits the rest of society greatly. So in that case, I would be like, yeah, tax them a little bit more, whatever, and then that's okay. The same way with the indigenous people sitting on the land, I'd be like, okay, build a pipeline through the land. There's a little bit of harm done, but it benefits everybody else greatly.
I accept that. What about reparations though? I know this is like typically something that right-wing people will say, but realistically, if we try to make a societal effort to reinvest in like black businesses and black neighborhoods and recompense there, that's going to be a societal displacement of wealth from everyone, including other minority groups, towards like one group of people.
So without knowing like the first of all, calling it reparations is weird.
I agree it's a bad term, but you just
the only thing that hurts me with reparations is like, man, if you were like an American Indian and black people started getting reparations, I would be fucking so mad. Like,
that's maybe the priority list could be.
Yeah, I guess like I'm just kind of thinking, but I mean like you could. I don't really care if you call it reparations or not. Clearly, African American communities in the United States need help. It feels like I don't know. I would have to look at like tax structures more, but it feels like there's got to be enough money at the top to help these people that like people in the middle and bottom don't have to throw so much out to like bolster poor communities. Like there has to be a better way that we can structure our tax system, whether it's through more capital gains increases or higher taxes at the end, at the upper end of the bracket. Like there has to be some way to distribute money to these people that like makes it work, that doesn't just take money from a bunch of middle class or poor people.
Okay, well I would agree with that, but I thought that you were generally okay with means testing and didn't like the universality of programs because you didn't think it lent any benefits.
Well, yeah, I think means testing is really good, but what does that have to do with what we're talking about?
I thought you were saying like insofar as you attempting to apply like the wealth redistribution with regards to reparations, you would try to do so in such a way as to avoid targeting certain groups. Oh, I think I misheard you. I misheard. My apologies. I misheard you. I thought you said the opposite of what you said. Okay, I acknowledge your point then.
Oh yeah.
If I can bring that around
can I
then.
ask a question?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
I want to make sure that we're on the same. So, Destiny, specifically, I gave you that example yesterday of because look, I agree with you that there are certain circumstances in which a minority group of let's say like less than 1,000 people. Like, let us say in a hypothetical world, they have a very valuable resource on their land that is required to, like, let's say even save the rest of the population that surrounds them. Obviously, that is a scenario where the autonomy of an entire populace will take precedence over the autonomy of, let's say, 500 people. I'm not ruling out as a possibility that that type of invasion, which it quite literally is, would not be warranted. But we were specifically talking about the Canadian cases that exist right now, where we are trying to put a pipeline through. And I would say that the benefits that this gives to the average Canadian does not at all come close to overpowering the blatant violation of international law for one, Canadian law for another, and also just the ethical quandaries that would surround invading a native person's people's homes and eradicating their culture as a result.
I mean, I just don't believe you because I'm pretty sure the majority of the I can't pronounce their names. I'm pretty sure the majority of them have voted on it, and the majority of them are okay with
Give me
it.
a source.
So.
Give me a source in that. There's no source of that.
Didn't every single democratically elected leader be okay with it? And the only ones that were opposed to it were the hereditary ones, and they kicked off the 3 other hereditary ones that were also okay with it?
Again, this is the complicated thing around their specific governmental structure, because the way that the band council is elected is not the same way that, for example, we would elect our local representatives. The band council is not only elected by all people of the general nation. It is elected only by people who are on the Indian register, and not all Indigenous peoples are on the Indian register.
How many aren't on the register?
I can't. Again, we don't have.
Like you're not well informed enough on the opinion to have a.
No, Destiny, is that there are they are not numbers for those things.
Wait, we're presupposing we're presupposing the legitimacy of a democratic effort to justify their involvement here.
Sure.
Destiny, if they disagreed with it. Would that make a difference to you?
Rem keeps saying a lot of people don't like this. A lot of people don't like that. A lot of people blah blah blah. And it's like, okay, well, the democratically elected leaders are all in favor of it. It's like,
I'm not familiar with the extent to which I'm not familiar with the extent to which the people agree with it. But since fundamentally our disagreement is not on whether or not they agree with it, but whether or not they should have a right to oppose it if they do disagree with it, I'd rather we focus specifically on that.
Sure. I think this is one of the reasons why I would, if they were part of I don't know how Canada's parliament system works, but it's probably similar to the US's. If they were part of that parliamentary system where different states had different amounts of representations, maybe they could get something in exchange for it, right? If they don't like the way that their schooling system is treated, or if they want more federal funds or whatever, that could be part of the negotiation.
That's the issue, is that they would see this as absolute assimilation. You remove their traditional hierarchical governmental structures that are tied in to their culture, their governmental systems, the role of an economic chief, the role of an overall chief. These are things that are baked into their culture and the way that they interact with the land.
How large is the
why don't you care?
Well, because of how large is the tribe of people?
The Wet'suwet'en, I think, is 2,000 or so.
Yeah, I just don't care.
That's a might mix, right?
We're talking about it's a matter of prioritizing.
I'll get the specific numbers.
It's a matter of prioritizing the will of 2,000 people to the detriment of the 40 million citizens that live in Canada. I'm sorry. I mean, if you can't move 10 miles away and it's that big of a deal.
My concern here, and I know I can't. I know for a fact that I can't move you over on this. It's just it's frustrating to me that you would adopt that position when I know you would rebuke my arguments that laws are passed to the benefit of a few thousand corporations that end up hurting the rest of the country.
Wait, why do you think I would rebuke that?
Sure. Okay.
Favor most corporate law in the United States. Calm down. I know you think or not you, but a lot of people say I'm a right winger, but I'm incredibly far left when it comes to my economic position.
I would have to go back and watch your videos to see any specific things that I think we have a disagreement on. Didn't we both basically agree that Citizens United was a nearly impossible constitutional or moral task to solve?
You guys can have this discussion, but I want to hammer on the fact that if we're talking about this specific case, the Wet'suwet'en case, okay, your contention here is that by instilling this pipeline, that positive that it brings to the general populace is going to outweigh, this essential cultural genocide against the Wet'suwet'en people. Okay?
I guess they'll probably be fine after the pipeline. I think they'll be okay. I think they'll make it.
Okay, I would disagree.
Wait, out of curiosity, if we could reverse the roles, okay, swap the genders, all right? Let's say we're talking about an alternative position where we live in an autocratic hierarchy, like our state is fundamentally undemocratic, and there's a small community of people who live in a say democratic special exempted section of that country, so like a reservation, and they democratically came to conclusions that were not conducive to the broader interests of the autocratic nation. Would you, with your current moral beliefs, say it's probably reasonable for those autocrats to take that land and do what they will with it because you don't really care, as a matter of priority, about the democratic beliefs of the people who are being downtrodden?
I mean, as much as I hate to say it, generally I tend to side almost de facto with people that are a little bit more democratic. That might be my inner liberal speaking.
There's nothing wrong with democracy, friend.
I don't know about that.
I take it back. There's nothing worse about it than other things.
Sure. I think that inherently, I think that the autocratic people have a very strong argument to make. And I could definitely understand, as much as I might hate certain autocratic or totalitarian or authoritarian governments, I can understand when they're like, hold on, rest of the world. Why are you getting so fucking mad? These are supposed to be our special administrative region. Why the fuck are you trying to tell us what we can? I can definitely see the conflict there and the irritation that certain autocratic states might have with the rest of the world saying, well, hold on, like here. But like these situations are obviously very complex too because of treaties signed with other nations as well. But yeah, I mean, like, in general, in principle, I could understand the larger autocratic state being like, well, hold on, we're going to roll over this democratic region, fuck them.
Do you think it's conceivable that the act of building the pipeline through the Wet'suwet'en territory would end up, in a consequentialist sense, doing more harm long term because it would further normalize I guess the obliteration of minority rights and autonomy in favor of like a broader national pursuit? I feel like, and I'm not saying this is exactly equivalent. I'm only saying I feel like it's similar to a lot of other arguments a person could make that would start bordering on cultural genocide.
And can I just rephrase that? Because I just want to, because this is a specific question I have for you, Destiny, is how is it that the benefits of this pipeline specifically would somehow outweigh the cultural genocide of the Wet'suwet'en people? That's the question I want to know.
Because the cultural genocide of 2,000 people is like first of all, I don't even believe it would be an entire cultural genocide. And then secondly, it's hard to weigh like their discomfort having to move to some areas versus the actual material harm. I hate that fucking phrase, but against the actual material harm that would be caused to a lot of Canadians that don't have the ability to take advantage of those resources.
Who is really going to be harmed by not having this pipeline? Do you know?
Any Canadian that would have had a job that would have been involved with any of these industries. So everybody from lawyers that litigate things, all the way down to construction workers that build the pipipeline, all the way down to anybody that works in a fossil fuel related job.
Do you think job creation is the only important thing when it comes to this type of thing, though? Do you not think, like Vaush was saying, that the long-term environmental effects that the pipeline will have, and the fact that we're not putting energy
I haven't touched on the environmental yet, but I was curious.
The environmental, you're a big loser there, because if you want to talk about environmental effects, you have to invest in green energy. Right now, not building the pipeline probably has worse environmental effects because that same oil either has to be driven or it has to be transported overseas, which is going to be an even greater contributor to greenhouse gases, we might guess. But regardless, like in terms of like long-term harm, like I'm a huge globalist cuck. I think as many people should be rolled into like as large a fucking culture as possible. I think that people can have their own little areas and their own, like they can have their own little traditions and all that is great. But the idea of like sectioning off some parts of the world and being like, this is for, this indigenous people only. This is only for, white nationalist, Eurocentric people. This is only for like, nah, I'm not as big
but this is what I was talking to Vaush about at the start of the stream here, because I agree with you that at the end of the day, there needs to come a point, if we want to have this globalist union of all peoples in the world, obviously we can't have these segments of lands that are, completely off limits to everyone else. And I was even telling Vaush this, reservations are not really off limits to anyone who is not a member of that reservation. That is not how these indigenous cultures behave. They are incredibly welcoming to all people. What they don't like is the Canadian government, who imposed upon them a very strict form of government that went against their wishes after they continually oppressed them for centuries, to the point where it's only been in the past couple of decades that we are now hearing these stories of the oppression that took place, over the last 50 years. These people don't want that same government coming in and shoving a pipeline through their land.
Wait,
this is not about them.
Is there another place the pipeline could be built? I understand this is an obscenely childish question, but if there was an additional expense the Canadian government could incur to put that pipeline elsewhere, does anyone know if there's a feasible?
So my understanding, because I read a bit about the Keystone Pipeline, which I know isn't the same here, but generally there's
the gas link. Yeah.
Yes. So generally there's a lot of different committees that come together to evaluate like the safest and cheapest and most feasible way of like laying a pipeline or whatever. My guess is going to be that this is the one that they ruled would have the least ecological damage and would have like the easiest to build and the less shit to tear up or whatever. That would be my guess on this.
You know how
they're just doing it because they really want to fuck over these indigenous people.
I didn't think that. I don't think they care that much, though. They haven't historically.
Well, if we want to be real, they do care, if for no other reason.
From an optics, because it would get them in shit if they didn't. I mean, like fundamentally, I don't think they care much about
it's illegal. They'd be most concerned about the legal repercussions of it, because ultimately, if this goes to Canadian court, which it almost certainly will, this is what I was telling Vaush.
Sorry, let me clarify. Their point of care doesn't come from the same cucky, bleeding heart liberal shithole that my chest holds. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so with that being said, is it conceivable, Destiny, do you think, that the that much in the same way that it is often beneficial to lie to other people, but it ultimately hurts you because if it comes out you're a liar, no one will ever trust you again. Do you think that establishing a reputation on the part of the Canadian government for engaging in this sort of behavior might ultimately lead to a subversion of values which are thetical to, maintaining a democratic society? I know for a fact.
We're talking about like establishing a rule that's going to lead to future harm, right? This is why I said that, like, I don't think you can have I don't think these reservations, I don't think that makes sense. Like, there are so many problems related to how these are ran, at least in the United States, maybe not in Canada, but definitely in the United States. It feels like it would just make more sense to roll them into your federal system.
I know you keep saying that, but these people resist that. They see that literally as cultural genocide, Destiny. That is what they view that. You would be eradicating their culture as a result.
Cool. Well, sounds like Paul Revere or somebody needs to go ride around or get some Federalist Papers written up by John whatever and try to convince him to join.
Well, to be fair,
but I'm explaining to you how they are going to actually view that act. You say, well, why can't they do? Because look at the
my issue is that was also a might makes right argument. If you believe, the argument you would make, the argument you would have to make would be that I believe the utilitarian benefit that we get out of the placement of this pipeline, even if it leads to what they would consider to be cultural genocide, is still ultimately better for society. But when you defer back to this, better hope they join with Paul Revere thing, what it makes it sound like is, it is a shame they don't have the strength to enforce their will. I think that's a fair reading.
That. I just think it's kind of silly to assume that, it's literally impossible for these people. They're such savages that it's impossible that they could ever exist under a larger federal system, that their culture will necessarily disappear immediately.
Why not just listen to what they fucking say, Destiny? You can literally listen to
because they already voted on it and they disagreed with you. The council already voted.
Oh my God. No,
to be fair, we know this does happen, though.
You are ignoring the way that the government has structured the First Nation organization.
You literally admitted yourself that you don't know how many people aren't able to not vote.
The issue, I'm sure we can all agree that the Wet'suwet'en people wouldn't literally fucking die if they had to move or join up with the broader. I don't think Rem actually thinks that. What I do
is that it's threats.
Wait.
That would be the worst impact.
What I do think is that we've kind of seen this pattern play out before in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East, when people, I guess we would call them indigenous by today's standards, have their borders or their geographic cultural heritage carved up by the bureaucratic expectations of Western or any more powerful governments. It generally leads to outcomes that are very devastating in the long term. And while I don't think that the Wet'suwet'en people are some sort of horrifically genocidal, or sorry, not genocidal, animalistic people who could possibly survive without whatever rivers and forests they were born next to, Destiny, as a person who has a fairly low expectation of the average person, I'm sure you can understand that such a cultural uprooting would lead to long-term suffering and systemic inequality going probably many generations into the future. That kind of stuff just can't really be done well, I don't think.
Assuming that the people are compensated adequately, so financially, obviously there's going to be a house destroyed or you have to move, that you should be provided the funds or whatever, like you would with an eminent domain thing, at least in the United States. I imagine they have similar things in Canada. Yeah, you would have to compensate the people for. I refuse to believe that there exists some group of people on the planet that are so incapable of moving to a different area, given financial means and everything to do so, that their whole culture will just die out. That just sounds ridiculous, absurd to me. I'm sorry.
Maybe not die out, but be wounded severely. No, I'm sure you can.
I refuse to believe that. No, I don't believe
that.
Wait,
can we talk about that? Because I feel like that's a strange position for you to take. When we say die out, I mean, I'm sure you can imagine, and I apologize if I'm being reductivist here. I don't know fuck all about what the Wet'suwet'en people believe, but I'm sure we can imagine that, especially for some indigenous cultures, the tie to the land in which you have been raised for centuries, I imagine, is great enough that the removal from that land is going to be more emotionally damaging to those groups than any amount of material compensation could ever possibly restitute them for. And while I agree, as a big brain,
another river or another piece
but it's not.
But
wait. But you recognize another tree is not the same. Wait. But yeah, I don't want to get all bleeding heart about this, but you recognize
bleeding heart is stating basic facts about the way that indigenous people view their culture and land, and it's being dismissed like it's not relevant. Okay, well, that's the entire thing of the discussion.
I know they can find another river, another tree, but considering some of these cultural forms develop over the course of centuries. The idea that you can just go like, well, here you go, guys. Look, that big tree over there. That kind of looks like your old village tree, doesn't it? And you've got that over there. I think this is a little bit naive. If you want to acknowledge that because there are two routes you can take here, I think, that are reasonable. You can either say that cultural damage they will suffer is irrational because culture shouldn't derive from your geographic location, in which case, fuck them, which would be consistent, I guess, if maybe a little heartless. Or you could say, I simply don't care about the damage done to the culture because utilitarian benefit, blah, blah, blah. But deferring to this whole they'll find another tree thing, I think, kind of demonstrates a paternalistic disregard for the structure of their culture that might be hampering your ability to understand.
I was dealing at society deals with the cities, annex other cities. We dealt with it in Nebraska when Omaha had to annex a city so that they could continue to expand outwards to the economic benefit of everybody. Like, I guess the city doesn't have as much a culture as like come on, right?
I'm not a cuck, dude, but you know that's true.
Come on, dude, you're literally telling me that like, well, fuck the 40 million Canadians. Like these people have these as their favorite
no. I'm just no. Wait, please, Rem, please,
They can't
please, Rem, please, Rem, please. Wait, please, guys, please. I have a question. Wait, can I answer?
How much economic damage would have to be suffered before they would have to find a new tree? Can you tell me that?
I'm not telling you that there's a threshold. I'm asking you to acknowledge that there is unique cultural damage being done, and then to say, in spite of that, okay. But when you say stuff like they'll find another tree or the city of Omaha was incorporated, I think you're downplaying it, and that makes me wonder if you understand the extent to which this could.
I do. You guys are making these fucking weird ass white nationalist arguments.
No, please. I've done this whole arc myself. Please don't make me go through it.
Cultures change. Rosh, I know you know this, Vaush. Cultures change and adapt to new stuff all of the fucking
But there's a difference. There's a difference between
different people. They move through different mediums all the time.
But the critical.
If these people move, will there be some damage caused to the culture? Sure. Are there going to be stories revolving around certain lands that they maybe won't be able to tell anymore, or that will be lost? Sure, that's possible. But I bet they'll get new stories. I bet they'll develop a new culture. I bet they'll integrate past stuff into new stuff. That's just how
that is entirely possible. But the difference here is we're talking about mitigative periods of damage. When cultures change naturally through the ebb and flow of people and time, there's no damage point there. Wait, I'm sorry. Let me clarify, because I don't want to misspeak, okay? Culture has changed massively over the past 20 years in the United States of America, but this is done through a fairly natural process of people...
There's no such thing as natural culture change.
Well, okay, wait. I'm sorry. I need you to commit to that statement then. Do you believe that with regards to culture, there is no fundamental difference between the natural ebb and flow of culture over time and a culture being destroyed by the actions of a state, deliberately in favor of economic benefits? Do you think there's a fundamental difference between the culture of the African tribes in the West Bank changing and the culture being destroyed?
You like 17 questions. Let's focus on one question.
It was one question phrased in two different ways.
So the first part of the question is there a difference between culture being changed by a state versus naturally? Is that what you're asking, or?
Do you think there are different...
Before you ask the question, here's the counter I'm going to give you, right?
Okay.
Is white nationalists include, like, we'll say things like immigrants are foreign invaders that are ruthlessly changing our culture, right? Like, that's an argument that I've heard. Is that like that does kind of happen, right? When enough of a certain type of people move in there, does the culture change? Well, yeah, to some extent. Now, would I consider that natural or unnatural? Well, I don't know. Talking about natural changes of culture is really weird. When Mount St. Helens exploded, that added a lot of culture to a lot of, or Mount Vesuvius or other like giant volcanic eruptions, that changed the culture. That was natural, right? But that was also violent, and that was like very extreme. Like, I don't know, when you ask me about a natural culture change versus an unnatural one, I mean, like, that's...
Would you mind if I didn't use the word natural and used a more specific term?
In the same way that Indigenous people it's not a fair comparison.
But even if we're not talking about like different modes of oppression here, then how about we say that different ways in which a culture can be changed can be destructive in very different ways. So American culture has changed massively over the past 20 years. I'm a little fucking baby. I've barely registered it. I've just been playing video games. But the culture of the black people who were brought over from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade probably, well, I mean, that was a culture change, and fuck it, they did get another culture. African-American culture today, I mean, we synthesized through a bunch of different like syncretic forces, is a pretty powerful force. I mean, fucking... Is
the most powerful driving force across several media.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did some... they're good. Yeah.
The world in terms of jazz, hip-hop, all came from
Africa. No, that's it. No, and I agree. And if we displace the Wet'suwet'en people and 200 years later, they invent mega future jazz, that's great. But can we recognize that didn't...
Real quick, just to be clear, that doesn't justify bringing African-Americans over.
I know you didn't mean... I know you didn't mean that.
I just need to say that because I know Rem was like real quick to make that trade. I know he was waiting to.
Okay, I know you. I know you didn't mean that, but do you understand how it can be a little bit callous and maybe even a little ignorant to say, well, the damage done to their culture is irrelevant because in some indeterminate number of centuries they'll find a way to pick back up?
Yeah, it's callous because you're making me defend the one side of this while no one here will address the other side, which are the tens of thousands of more potential Canadians who are being damaged by having to sell their oil for cheap.
But that's
they don't have access to markets in the West. Or all of the people that are unemployed right now after COVID-19 who aren't going to get any jobs related to fossil fuels because we can't build the pipeline for you. Like, how do you defend all of that?
That's my genjutsu. That's my Kekai Genjin. I agree with you. The implementation of the pipeline in a utilitarian sense probably does do more good than whatever harm it does to the Wet'suwet'en people. But my goal for that, in having a conversation on it, wouldn't be to downplay the extent to which it would do damage to their culture, but rather to acknowledge the fact that A, this is a horrible situation, and B, what systemically can we do to mitigate damage done to the greatest possible extent. I just want you to say, we will do horrible damage to them.
Yes, for woke points, I can acknowledge that, but everyone in here earlier just said there is no material compensation for the loss of that land. So it doesn't seem like there's anything we can do to prevent any systemic harm anyway.
Well,
that's just a pill you got to swallow.
Well, we can talk about that. How much do you think, how much would you believe it would be worthwhile for the Canadian government to sacrifice in order to appease the people they're harming with this?
That should be very fucking easy for the Canadian government to calculate, because I'm sure there is some vested economic interest in having this pipeline up, so they could give maybe a percentage of the profits that are gone by running that pipeline to the people, or maybe they could pay them fair value for the land that they're going to be infringing on, or maybe they can give them, some flat sum based on I don't know, any number of things. I'm sure is a huge economic drive in Canada to get this pipeline built, so there should be the money back behind it to compensate the people whose land you're essentially invading and taking for said pipeline space. That should be there.
Okay, but my main issue here, and I agree that that's a take that can be defended, is that it felt like the presuppositions you were making in order to arrive at that conclusions were what we're doing isn't so bad, they'll get over it. It's protecting culture is dumb anyway. If we can acknowledge that great harm is being done, I think we can have a more reasonable conversation about how to mitigate it.
Sure, I guess great harm is being done then, sure.
Do you think I'm being unfair?
No, I think you're being fair. It's just something I don't care about. But I think you're being fair. I understand. I think we probably agree mostly on this. Vaush is more trying to be more rhetorically safe. I understand that I would acknowledge that yeah, of course there's going to be some harm and there's going to be some irreplaceable part of that culture that'll change. But I think that people like Rem take it way too far with this cringy fucking white person take of oh, their whole culture is going to be destroyed with the pipeline. I'm pretty sure these people have suffered so much more in the past. These people have suffered so much more over the past 400 years that a single pipeline going through 20,000 square kilometers of land isn't going to wipe them off the face of the earth.
I can defend Rem too. Yeah.
Vaush, you look at the way that he's acting. I'm trying to ask you legitimate questions. You refuse to answer them in any serious way. So
wait, I don't, or he doesn't?
You don't, Vaush.
Oh shit. No, okay, just clarifying. Okay, wait. You two are both obviously triggered as fuck by each other by the earlier conversation. Okay, I think that's fairly obvious. Okay, no, I've been watching you long enough. Okay, buddy. So that's fine. Okay, I get it. It's a difficult conversation. All right, I'm just trying to fucking play Terraria. But if we're going to have this conversation, it's important to me that we're all coming to it from the same basic presuppositions. Acknowledging that great cultural harm is being done is very important as a presuppositional step for me. Much in the same way that I can't have a conversation about reparations with people who are making arguments like, well, they should have been over slavery by now. Even though that isn't necessarily intrinsically a component of their end argument, it makes me think there might be biases leading into it. So if we've acknowledged that is the case, if we've acknowledged that great cultural harm is being done, do you have any reasonable solutions for what could be done? Rolling them into the dominant culture?
You have to materially compensate them. That's the only thing I can think of. You can't
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, what's up?
Okay, so this is one thing that really bugged me because one of my biggest issues that I've had with you, regardless, because ultimately, if you had just said at the end of the day that the utilitarian outcomes, for example, of instilling the pipeline and the benefit that brings to the average, Canadian, that will, in a sense, outweigh the benefits that it would cause to the Indigenous people to not have a pipeline shoved through their land. If that was ultimately your only statement, we would not have the type of spat that we currently have. My biggest issue is the way that you've come at this topic and completely dismissed the culture and the legitimate culture and worldview that Indigenous people have, as well as ignore the actual Canadian history by which something like the Band Council was instituted on the Indigenous people. And that's what I think is quite bigoted, because you ignore these very real issues that are actually afflicting the Wet'suwet'en people And your entire rhetoric when we had our discussion yesterday, and the rhetoric that you have made during this conversation, is my biggest issue with you. And I don't understand why you won't actually discuss that topic with me.
I don't disagree with anything that Rem has said, by the way, just if I'm throwing my weight in one direction. This feels to me a little bit like it feels to me a little bit like the moving conversation, or like the just move thing, where I'm sure that if you and I like sat down and had an argument about the effect that like moving can have on like systemic poverty and how it can be difficult for an individual to move, we would agree. But in the context of the conversation that we were having, it felt like you were massively downplaying that to make a point. And I understand that can be I'm not trying to dogpile or anything.
Well, first of all, I attacked your character because you literally pulled a Mr. Medicare snipe on like a tweet clip 30 seconds after we got. Like, I don't know if you like fucking came immediately after so that you could post that clip on Twitter. So yeah, fuck you. Okay. So the reason why I wouldn't use like some sort of like utilitarian calculus here is because like
the tweet,
the value of
that tweet. You agree with that tweet?
Do you not? Cool story, bro. Okay, so the problem is
what
that
tweet?
Like,
just so I know what exactly is being referred to here. I'm just curious. I don't know.
I tweeted out basically an exact statement of what his position is that at the end of the day, for the sake of benefiting the average American Canadian, we are free to displace these Indigenous people from their land, thereby, as you acknowledged in our discussion yesterday, essentially committing cultural genocide against their culture. That is what you admitted to when you said, ultimately, if that's the cause of it, then I don't care. That is what you said. And you've even restated that today on this stream. And you're treating it like it's this massive character attack in which, like, even though that's literally what you advocated for, and instead you go on stream and say that I'm only doing philosophy to make it feel good, that I don't really care about Indigenous people, I just want to be
white. Don't forget that one.
Vicious character attacks that are completely unwarranted. When I literally just
we love white people here, so it's okay.
You said on stream yesterday and what you said on stream today. That's why I'm pissed off, and you're treating it like this was this massive takedown of you when I literally stated what you said. Unless you disagree with the way that I stated
tweet. So I'll explain what Rem's tweet was. I'll explain what the implications are. Rem is going to say, "Oh, I didn't know that was the implications," and then we'll be back at ground zero, I guess. So Rem tweeted, Destiny saying that the Canadian government should invade all native communities if the natural resources are wanted, remove them from their lands, and thereby assimilate them into Canadian culture. So the implication of what you're saying there is that Canada literally marches its fucking military into native lands, kills them or kicks them the fuck out, and then forces them to wear like fucking whatever clothes that normal Canadian people.
The clips, Destiny. I attached to that tweet.
So now here's where he denies the implication, and then we both have to agree to disagree.
Can I say that while I do think that
want to commit genocide against all those people and literally kill them all?
I don't think Rem's characterization of your argument was any more hyperbolic than yours at some points, though.
You could maybe said that the Canadian government should invade the fucking lands with guns.
Okay, I apologize. Wait, I apologize if I'm misremembering because I do legitimately have a very bad memory. But I think you actually in this conversation said that what the Canadian government would do is essentially invade the land. I think I remember that.
What I'm saying is that like if push came to shove with like some global catastrophe, that at the end of the day, that's probably what would happen. Yeah, like if there was like a global oil shortage or some shit, and like everything was fucked and people couldn't drive their cars, then yeah, they probably would start to invade like sovereign land. I'm not saying that should be like a first resort. Like let's just start invading all of the like native territories.
That's the only way that they can get that. You would support invading their land, displacing them, and by result eradicating their culture, which is what my tweet stated. And then you come back at me with this vicious character attack, accusing me of being a white savior, not actually caring about Indigenous people. Like, what the fuck? I understand you think that's really funny.
Wait,
hold on, please. Canadians so much? Can you tell me why you don't care about native Canadians?
Would it be possible for me to jump in here really quickly? My issue.
I just want to know why. I want to know why Rem fucking hates Canadians and oil workers so much.
I also am very curious, but I will have to get to that in just a second because I'm very curious about something myself. Destiny, you're saying that you didn't say that you would advocate for the Canadian government invading the Wet'suwet'en people, only if there was some sort of global catastrophe or something along that lines. Can I ask you, if the Canadian government decided to implement the pipeline and the Wet'suwet'en people said, no, we're defending our land, would you then advocate the Canadian government has the moral authority, the right to go on ahead and essentially invade the land to implement the pipeline?
Yeah, I think if you run it down all the way, I think yeah.
Okay, I mean, then my follow up to that.
This is true of literally like every form of law, right? So for instance, like should a police officer be able to kill you for a speeding ticket?
No, then if you try and attack him, yeah. But my problem then is, you've had conversations in the past before where people say, I'm not violent, I just want to demographically displace non-white people from the country. To which you say, well, how is that non-violent? What happens if they resist? And then say, well, we kill them. And then you say, well, that sounds pretty violent. The violence is implicit in the state action.
Sure, but the difference here is that like the difference here is that it seems like the majority of these people, or I guess there's a lot of people, whatever that means to Rem, that are against this. It seems like there is a reasonable deal that can be reached here. I don't think it's reasonable to offer to pay all African Americans to leave the United States.
But aren't we presupposing the value of their democratic input, though? Because we're making the argument that it doesn't matter what they want.
And Vaush, this is exactly the point I was trying to make to you, Destiny, is because there needs to be a real conversation about the status of the band councils in the Wet'suwet'en Nation.
Yeah, I agree. They should be rolled into Canadian's federal system.
I'm just saying that since we're
discussion about the legitimacy of that democratically elected band council.
I'm just saying since we're presupposing the irrelevant. Wait, one minute. If we're
Rem is trying to defend monarchs to you right now in patriarchy.
Listen, I'll do that.
Actual serious discussion.
I'll take a crack at that. I'll take a crack at that next. I just want to say, if we're presuming the unimportance, the not illegitimacy, the irrelevance of the democratic will of the Wet'suwet'en people, which we fundamentally have here in this consequentialist argument, blah, blah, we need to do what's better for the people. If we're doing that, then we're implicitly suggesting that their will isn't really relevant, which means that the state action imposed on them is one which will always carry with it the de facto threat of violence, i.e. the characterization of your argument as Canada invading the Wet'suwet'en people, while hyperbolic, is honestly, I don't think, dishonest.
I think it's dishonest because I don't think reasonably it would ever come to that. Much the same way that if I were to tweet out, I think you should be able to murder.
Has happened in the past 20 years, Destiny. No,
Rem,
the Canadian government
Rem, I just want to let you know two things, Rem. One,
reservations.
I just want you. Okay, I understand. I have two responses to you, Rem. One, I don't care. Two, plus
it's not reasonable.
Okay. So if I were to tweet out, okay.
When did you get on that, Destiny? You're white.
If I were to tweet out that, like, I am half Cuban. Plus you're white. Okay. Sure. I don't think that police officers, okay, if I say something like, oh, I think that like speeding should be illegal, and somebody were to retweet that and be like, oh, Destiny's position is that you should be able to be murdered for driving your car 5 miles per hour over the speed limit. Technically, they're right? If a police officer pulls you over, you resist arrest, you don't get into the car, they try to like, they write you a ticket, you say no, they're like, okay, well, I have to detain you, they say no, they start fighting you, and invariably, that would at some point escalate to violence, right?
Would you retract your arguments with the ethnostaters then?
Literally a position where
I'm sorry.
People are not willing to give up that land. So of course, what is going to be the end result?
What did you say, Mike? Would you retract your arguments with the ethnostaters then, where you say that it's fundamentally violent to try and deport people from their homes because there's a very high likelihood of them resisting? I imagine if the U.S. government sent soldiers to my town and just started rounding up black folk, a lot of them would just go along with it because they don't have rifles and tanks. Would you then argue that's not fundamentally a violent action because you would imagine there are routes for that to take place that don't involve, like, killing them?
No, I would argue that it's different because, one, they would probably never make a good faith effort to even do the compensation route in the first place. I seriously doubt that everybody would be okay, like, oh, we'll give every black person like $250,000 to move to another country. And then two, because I don't think that that's like a reasonable route that anybody's looking at right now in terms of like, oh, like I think that most black people would leave the U.S. given a certain amount of money. Whereas it does look like there is a deal that can be reached with Native peoples in regards to building a pipeline through their land.
What if that turned out not to be the case, that the ability to live in your homeland as a black person here in America is as a bit as valuable to them as the ability for them to live in their homeland as Wet'suwet'en people?
Then I think at some point, I think as a Canadian, I think you have to ask yourself like what you value more, and if maybe like, so because let's say that it does come to the point to where like, oh, well, they're standing there, we're gonna have to fucking kill these people to build a pipeline. You have to think, well, am I okay rolling tanks through and just murdering, 2,000 people in this tribe, or maybe should we consider building the pipeline, across a different area? I think maybe that would be the question you'd have to ask yourself. I think most people would probably say like, well, maybe we try to find a way to reposition the pipeline.
What would your answer be?
What would my answer be?
If there was no way to implement it without like state violence being enacted against those people,
which is almost certainly what
we would have to make. You don't know that, Rem, because you don't know anything about these people because you're totally unread here. Plus you're white.
No, hold on.
Why are you doing that?
Get away with this. I know you're just doing it to trigger me, but you're making blatant lies on the stream. And then when I actually try to explain a single thing about the Wet'suwet'en people, you completely ignore me.
I think he's doing it because it works.
It's funny. I get DGG thinks it's funny. But you're talking about an actual serious.
I just want to make sure that nobody forgets here what's going on. Okay, I just want to get all the facts on the table. Okay.
No,
so anyway,
are the Polish white?
So like, Rem, allowing him to do this on
wait,
stream.
Wait, Rem. Wait, no, please. I'm the host. The reason, Rem, the reason why. I'm the host and the moderator this time, okay?
Oh, you're not moderating.
And he's white.
I'm white. Listen, I'm trying to engage the way I can because I feel like you two have some serious mutual biases that you're engaging in right now, and I think that I don't know how well like the discourse is going to be arrived at from conversations between you two at this point.
You can just listen to the way that he's engaging.
Oh yeah. Oh wait. No. Yeah. He's treating you in super bad faith. Yeah, and you're trying to treat him in good faith, but he's only treating you that way because he.
Do you think I'm treating him in bad faith right now, Vaush?
No, I think you're making a good faith effort, but I think that he is under the impression that your initial efforts in engaging with him were bad faith or at least misinformed enough that he doesn't have a reasonable expectation of engaging with you in good faith. And at that point, there's no way to have a. I mean, I can't speak for him or anything. That's just the impression.
That's all you seem to care about.
That's why I'm streaming this on my channel and it's going to be uploaded later. You got it. Okay, so
why did you join our conversation?
Wait, me? Wait, are you
because
streaming?
I don't want you running around telling people that I'm like some imperialist colonizer that invade and murder and culturally genocide people.
Part of the tweet I sent out.
Okay, listen. Okay, there are two main reasons why I came in here. One, I don't want you going around telling people that I'm a literal in favor of invading and destroying fucking lands of people. And two, you're white.
Hold on, I never said that. I literally laid out.
Is this a new? Is this?
Did I not lay out very clearly what his position was? And has what he said differed at all from the way I characterized it?
I think that your characterization of his argument as the Canadian government is due in invading or I guess like displacing these people, I would consider that a fair characterization, though I think that there are different levels of charitability you could assign to that interpretation. Like, for example, there's a big difference between somebody saying like, well, I think that in a utilitarian sense, we derive more benefit from the use of that pipeline, so if it came to it, I'd be willing to enact state action with some kind of due compensation for the people, and what other people would interpret, which would be Destiny literally just wants to mow in with tanks and kill them and implement the pipeline.
But I attached the clips so people could actually
hear. He included the clips. Did you even look at the clips?
Destiny, why doesn't your friend follow me on Twitter?
I'm just saying, in the clips, I literally say, I think Canada should go in and murder every person that like doesn't pass the white person.
No, why are you
like
characterizing that? I didn't characterize you at all like that, so I don't know why you're peddling in these fucking lies. I don't understand.
He's using sneaky debate tactics, right?
I know he's just doing quips. I understand. It's funny. Haha. Like I get it, but I want to have an actual conversation about the issue. This is something I genuinely care about.
Okay, wait, but we've actually made pretty decent.
Wait, Vaush, you asked me an earlier question that I thought was really interesting. Okay, so you asked me, what if the people like wouldn't back down? What like pragmatically, what should Canada do? So like this is an interesting hypothetical to engagement. I'm going to avoid it. So the question would be like, how plausible is it to build a pipeline around? So for instance, let's say that there are two possible alternatives. Let's say that one, it's actually not that difficult. It would just cost like maybe another $250 million, right? Let's say that on the other hand, let's say that you have to go through like two tribes' ancestral lands at that point. And now you've got like double the contention, right? Do you acknowledge that like at some point, you are going to have to kind of like brute force it? Or do you just say like, well, sorry for the rest of you Canadian people, like these people in these lands have like authoritarian control within the borders of Canada. I know none of you guys have that. None of you other provinces have the rights that these people do. Their rights literally supersede your own, and you're all just going to have to suffer as a result of it.
Well, just keep in mind, the only reason why you're framing their relationship to Canada in that way is because they accept welfare from the government. Because if they didn't, if it weren't for the original history of colonization, the Wet'suwet'en people would probably be in a sovereign, truly sovereign territory. So it seems a little bit, okay, or something approximating it. What's difficult to me is putting them in a position where it's like, okay, well, unfortunately, you're ultimately subject to the will of the Canadian people because you're in a position where you take advantage of our like wealth and resources anyway. Why are they in that position? Oh, well, because we like killed your people like 300 years ago, you know?
Sure. The problem is that like, even if just to be clear, even if they weren't taking federal money, if they were their own sovereign state, we would start enacting other forms of violence on them to probably get them to buckle to the pipeline. Yeah. So for instance, we would probably start sanctioning them, or we would say like, okay, well, you're going to have tariffs or you're not allowed to trade with our country if you're going to oppose this thing. Rather than if you go along with this, then we would offer you some economic benefit. We'd either pay you direct cash transfer, or we would have like some preferential trade treatment or whatever.
Do you think it's morally permissible that more powerful nations should always have the ability to begin to damage the nations around them if they feel they can get something from it? I understand pragmatically.
Okay, hold on, because you phrase that in a way where it's like, oh, well, obviously we should always. But what you're considering is you're looking at two actors here. You're only looking at a big country and a small country, but you're not taking into account the people in that country. Because the way that you ask me that is really morally loaded. Do you think a big country should have a right to shit all over a small country? But I could just as easily flip that and go, do you think that a very small country with very few people should be able to destroy the material well-being of tens of millions of other people? Because that's how you could very easily phrase it.
But that would be an uncharitable phrasing of my argument, because you can't reasonably say the Wet'suwet'en people would be destroying anything if they already have a legal and moral right to the territory that controls the oil.
No, just because you have a legal and moral right doesn't mean you can't be damaging the material harm. Technically,
damaging kind of implies they're doing a harm as opposed to not doing a good. By not giving them the oil, they wouldn't be doing a harm, they'd be refraining from doing a good. The difference between like an obligatory and a supererogatory action is very important to me.
This gets into weird like doing versus allowing harm.
But I think that's valid. I would draw a hard line here. Yeah, based on the legacy of colonialism and the outcomes that it seems to bring about, I would be comfortable with saying that smaller nations should be able to defend their sovereign borders against the impositions of larger nations, even if doing so means the larger nation is going to have a population suffer more for it. Now, obviously, there's wiggle room there. That seems like
a weird position for me to demand that a nation have such ultra charitability to a smaller country next to it or within it that it's going to allow that country's existence to cause like material damage to some of its poorest citizens.
But the problem is like, that's only a choice. That's only a choice the tough nations get to make. The weaker nations never get to actually participate in that dialogue. They don't get to decide to what extent do I enforce soft political power on my neighbors. The issue with this is, even if you can make good arguments for it, where you're stacking the deck in favor of a system where the powerful nations are the only ones that have any real sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but that's kind of just an unfortunate reality of the world, right? Like, just because some smaller nations don't have as much bargaining power as larger nations, that means that larger nations should never bargain on behalf of their citizens. Like,
they can bargain, but there's a difference between bargaining and embargoes attempting to hurt the neighboring nation. It's just, it feels like we're like trying to play a game where we know for a fact which groups are going to win. I don't know if that sits well with me, especially given the fact
of course. That, I guess my problem is that like we're valuing the culture, I guess, of some 3,000 people over like the material well-being.
Well, right now I'm not talking about the culture. I'm only talking about the sovereign rights of the Wet'suwet'en people, which are only subverted in this case due to a history of colonialism. If we ignore that, because I don't pay any respect whatsoever to the legal precedent of like which nations destroyed which ones.
I don't know if like the history of colonialism changes like any of the calculations here, other than like if you want to argue that the history of colonialism should be taken into account, then maybe like a larger cash transfer has to happen or something, I guess. But like because if we were to talk about the history of colonialism, we were talking about like actually compensating these people for what they've lost. The true answer at that point is we should give them back all of their lands, which means sailing back on over to Europe.
True, but
so that's never going to happen.
I would argue that the people who live now in Canada have like a right to their land as well. I don't know if they have a right to the. Well, because I don't like displacing people, which is why we're having this argument to begin with, right? I don't think that the Canadian people necessarily have a right to the natural resources of non-compliant, independent sovereign nations, and I don't think that the independent sovereign nations have a right to then, centuries later, displace people who were just born in Canada. I think it's really difficult to balance this geopolitically because no matter which way you go, you're probably going to contribute harm in some direction.
That seems like a weird like moral position to take where it's like, I'm going to do this harm so that my children don't have to. So like you move in, you invade all the sovereign lands, you say, I accept this moral evil. And then 100 years later, your children are like, oh, we can live on these lands, but it's okay because the evil was committed a long time ago. Thank God they made that sacrifice.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to hold the ancestors. I'm not going to hold people accountable for the moral wrongs of their ancestors. That seems pretty fucked up.
We kind of should a little bit, right? Like in the form of like reparations. I say that, but like recompensing like communities that have had their labor stolen or their land stolen or something. I guess like at the end of the day, like I acknowledge that it's pretty complicated. This is why I hate the concept of like these like reservations because they're never truly going to be sovereign, right? Everyone knows that it's not going to happen. And it seems like it would just make more sense to roll these people like into your actual federal system, give them a real voice in parliament, and then like incorporate them into your system like you would every other citizen.
Would you make the argument that there is no place left in the world for people, at least in our corner of the world, to exist outside the purview of a liberal democracy? That if your culture is fundamentally incompatible with one which is the basis of our legal system, that you shouldn't be given any space in which to practice that?
Wait, that you shouldn't be allowed to practice like another form of government? Or
yeah, like fundamentally, there's no room in our chunk of the world anymore for people to participate in like the hereditary tribal structures that the Wet'suwet'en people believe in. That like if you believe that shit, like sorry, you need to be rolled into the broader democratic liberalism of our society.
I think that you can practice it on a smaller level, like on a religious level. So for instance, like there are some Muslims that like to practice some forms of like Sharia law. So like if you steal something, maybe you get swatted a few times, or Catholics say that you have to form some amount or do some amount of contrition, like if you commit like a certain moral crime or whatever. I think that those smaller systems are okay. But in terms of how the larger government system works, you probably all should have to fall in line, I think, in order for it to work. The alternative to that is some form of anarchy.
Do you think it's possible to do that long term over a form of incentive structures rather than actively just rolling them in, like with some big legislation? Like, if I could think of a way to do this ideally, what I would imagine it would be is like maybe the broader government, or like the government of Canada, could try to offer like incentives or grants or some kind of tax reduction for people from Wet'suwet'en or other like associated territories if they decide to like live long term in those countries, and that way we'd have like this soft pressure to incorporate, which I think frankly a lot of them would prefer to, because I don't think that a young person born in Wet'suwet'en territory should be forced into their culture any more than I think somebody born in America should be forced into ours. And then if they're eventually like incentivized into rolling over here, then over the period of maybe like 60 or 70 years, the Wet'suwet'en culture is no longer substantial enough to hold claim to that territory. Sorry, that was a bit wordy, but like, do you think that would be
so
like...
basically you're asking me, would it be better to like slowly roll them in rather than to do it violently and in like 2 days, right?
Yeah, even if it meant a sacrifice. Yeah, like we wouldn't be able to get as much immediately.
Sure, there probably are more responsible ways to do it that could also maybe set a positive precedent in the future for other. But I mean, other people might just see that as like they're going to resist the entire way, and maybe it like well, fuck, I don't know. I would actually have to think about that a lot more.
I would have to do this. I don't have answers to this. I'm just curious.
Because like on one hand, it sounds good that you do it more gently, but on another hand, like you know how in the U.S. when we're like, maybe we should have background checks for private sales. Now, as much as it hurts to say this, a lot of conservatives that oppose background checks, they don't actually oppose background checks. What they're scared of is that, well, if we let you do background checks now, tomorrow you're going to want to take our guns. That they see it as like a slippery slope. Yeah. So I worry that like, yeah, any type of like deal that you start to make, people are like, well, no, fuck you. We're not going to do any of this soft shit because we know what your ultimate goal is, and that's assimilation. And we don't want to do that. That would be like my guess. Is that, or that could happen, right? As a result.
I know for a fact that would happen because there are people who are in my chat who believe that offering an incentive for people born in the Wet'suwet'en territories to join like the Canadian society broadly, that they would consider that cultural genocide. This is where I guess I depart from a lot of the woker people, because I believe the belief that a person, because of their blood, should be locked into the Wet'suwet'en culture is every bit as toxic as the idea that just because you're born into like a given ethnic group that you shouldn't be able to do other things with your life. If individual Wet'suwet'en people, through the course of their life, with no pressure from the state, want to live comfortably in like the broader purview of democratic liberal society, then I think that's probably a good thing. It's definitely a simpler thing in the long term, but if they don't want to, if they hold their land, I just don't know if I could morally excuse state action being taken to break apart their culture.
Sure, I understand, but I mean, I don't have as much of value in culture, and I'm obviously I don't know if you'd call me a statist, whatever the opposite of an anarchist is. I love states, and I love state power.
Cringe lord.
Yeah, I love it when the state tells individuals that you have to fucking fall in line for the benefit of everybody else. That shit gets my cock rock fucking hard. So I mean, yeah, I mean, when I look at like this much material benefit that could, or well-being that could exist across all of Canada, and there's just a few hundred people stopping it, yeah, I mean, I kind of fall inside of like, we need to figure out a way to make the pipeline work.
All right. Well, I think that at least in this conversation, you've come off a lot more conscientious of the long-term or material harm that it could potentially do. A slight departure, if I may. You said you hated me on Twitch. Do you still hold to that? Should I be offended, or are we
Every
just
time I talk to you motherfuckers, the next minute, as soon as you guys get on Twitter, you're like, in this conversation, Destiny said you wanted to murder everybody.
I have never done that
did it to me. You told me that my class clouded my judgment, and I hate you for it. But I don't hate you quite as much right now, because I don't hold grudges. So I hate you like 30% right now. Plus you're white, okay? So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I've watched the last few VODs, and I really haven't. This must be really new, the plus you're white thing. This must be like fresh out of the DGG fucking meme files.
I just think it makes some people really mad to be mad. I don't think it makes me mad, but I know it makes Rem mad. Because Rem was tweeting earlier, well, actually, I have a great-great-great-grandfather's aunt, okay, who had a dog that was owned by an indigenous person. So I just like to remind people to bring him down a knob at the end of the day, you know?
Listen, I'm a Slav, okay? There are some prominent white identitarians who wouldn't consider me a part of their club, so I think I'm still free.
Most white identitarians seem to forget that the Slavic people were super fucking hated by Hitler. Actually, it's pretty funny, but I'm sure you can. If Fuentes can weasel his way into white nationalism, I'm sure you can find a place there.
I can weasel my way out. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I love you, buddy. Be careful. Okay.
All right. Wait, is Rem even still here? Or did he just leave?
No, I would like to say that Rem said I was here for publicity. Rem is actually the one that left the call and went live. Plus, he's white. Bye.
Try to get along with him in the he's gone.
I want credit for Joshua, okay? I want to say that I ended his campaign run. Please, let me have this, guys.